Hi, it's a real pleasure to meet you all. I feel like I've sort of wandered into a kind of a keynote panel, so I hope I can make the best use of it. I'm a neuropsychiatrist at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience at King's College London. I sort of research immunopsychiatry, the relationship between the immune system and sort of mental health, and been working with Mike on a few projects also with Alexei Tolchinsky, and yeah, just very excited to be able to talk with you guys.
Yeah, so I have a list of things I was hoping to bounce off of you today. I don't know if anybody else has. I don't want to monopolize it. So if anybody else has topics, happy to do those.
I want to be monopolized.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, I think you initiated this multi-way conversation back by email.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. A few things. We'll just go down the list and see see how far we get. So one of the things I want to get your thoughts on is what you think might be an optimal, in some sense, an optimal degree of introspective ability. In other words, as we construct artificial agents, it would seem that we have some choice about how opaque the internal states are. Now, I'm sure there's reasons why you can't see them all and whatever, but there seems to be a spectrum of ways you can construct a cognitive architecture where the top level sees much or little or none about what's actually going on, right? So there's some degree of metacognition. And I wonder if you have thoughts on what is maybe the optimal amount. Should we strive to have more? Should we? I mean, obviously, if you do psychoanalysis, you try to get some insight. But if we construct agents, is there some way of cranking it up? Basically, yeah. What do y'all think about that?
So I'll start with a really simple thing, and then the clever people in the room can build upon it. The first thing is to say the absolute obvious, which is that a Markov blanketed agent, by its very nature, is always not going to have full access to its environment, including its body. So there's always going to be a degree of uncertainty. It's kind of like has to go with the territory. Then it comes to the question of how complex its model is. And there's as we again all know, there's a trade-off between complexity and accuracy. And I would imagine there's no fixed number. It's a dynamic trade-off. So it sort of automatically comes out in the wash. If you're trying to minimize free energy or minimize expected free energy, it's going to do that trade-off itself. So that's my opening gambit.
Does that mean do you think that that I'm wrong in that you can basically set the value across a range, and that really no matter what you do, it's always there's some attractor for the amount of introspection that any reasonable agent is going to have, or do you think there really are different ways to set that knob?
Look, it obviously depends on what the agent is trying to achieve. I'm assuming, as a kind of baseline case, what the agent is trying to achieve is continued existence. And then, setting it is dangerous, I would say. I would say that you can set it higher or lower than its optimal. Its optimal will come out of the algorithm, out of the attempt to optimize the trade-off between complexity and accuracy. But this is, Karl Friston 101. So maybe Karl Friston 201 wants to take it from there.
I normally go last, but I'm very happy to pick up on that one. Yeah, as usual, I agree entirely. Just a couple of points. I think, Mike, you noted that we'll never know because we can't disrupt the blanket to peep inside. But certainly, things will certainly behave as if they had introspection. And from the point of view of the free energy principle and its application to both natural and artificial intelligence, I think you can read that in a number of different ways. I think just to sort of put two potential ways of thinking about introspection on the table. One could be the kind of introspection that underwrites intelligent artifacts that can plan their future, that have intentions, and can simulate or have a generative model of the consequences of their actions to evaluate the goodness of any particular course of action in the future. So we're talking about certain kinds of things that behave as if they had intentions. And that necessarily, I think, implies some degree of introspection because you are now rehearsing your private future in order to select the next best thing to do, or it would look as if that is happening. I should just sort of note that there is another kind in the calculus that comes with the free energy principle. There's another kind of introspection, which is basically taking yourself offline to do some housekeeping on your generative model. Both of those kinds of mathematical homologs or images of introspection rest upon minimizing complexity. That hits you in the face in the second kind that you might associate with closing your eyes and thinking about things, or indeed sleep, taking yourself offline so that the accuracy disappears and you're just left now with the complexity. So you now just resolve or remove any redundant parameterization by possibly dreaming, or possibly just by having some kind of synaptic homeostasis if we're working with the brain. But coming back to the first kind that would underwrite planning and intentional behavior, I think Mark's right. Well, no, I think you're both right. That any one creature can have a very different kind of depth of planning and degree of introspection compared to another creature. And even within a creature, the depth of planning will be very variable. And it's not something that there are knobs in play, but the only knob that matters is the self-evidencing, the maximizing the marginal likelihood. And you get that for free with this first kind of introspection, in the sense that if you're very uncertain about the future, as your generative model rolls out into the future, conditioned upon a policy, uncertainty accumulates very, very quickly. And therefore, there's no, if you like, extra information in moving beyond a certain time horizon. So there will be times when you're very uncertain about your the context in which you're operating. And in those times, the degree of introspection will automatically shrink because, as Mark says, it's built in to the free energy minimizing process, simply because this system exists and therefore can be described as if it was minimizing its free energy or maximizing its marginal likelihood. So, if you think in this special case of introspection having this temporal aspect and having this temporal depth to it, that is going to be quite context sensitive and will depend upon the implicit uncertainty this artifact has about the consequences of its actions, some of which will, and the context in which those actions are taking place. And therefore, you can imagine when things are very predictable, you might plan a long way into the future, or if you're the kind of thing that lives or has co-constructed a niche where things are designed to be very predictable in the future, you can go to university, or you can go and cook your meal, then you will certainly have a very deep time horizon. But there'll be other situations where that just goes away. You're in trauma, you've lost a loved one, or moved to a new city where you can't plan that far into the future. So in that sense, there are really important knobs, but the knobs are self-tuning.
Yeah, if I could just add something about context here. I like to think in terms of the kind of type 1, type 2 distinction, which is I know is a bit obsolete and not terribly accurate. So contrast the kind of metacognition that's going on when you're driving on the freeway and your planning system is constantly directing your eyes to look this way or that, and your arms and legs to make this motion or that motion. with a very short time horizon and very fast reactions. But the meta system is doing a lot of work because it's integrating information from a lot of different incoming data streams, and it's allocating attention and activity to a lot of outgoing action streams. So there's a lot going on in that kind of setting that's properly metacognitive. But none of that is conscious. So I think when we think about metacognition, we're often thinking about conscious metacognition, which is, reflecting on how to write some sentence or something in a paper, or reflecting on what you're supposed to do today or something like that consciously. And I think that's just a tiny slice of metacognitive activity. And in developing any kind of autonomous system that has to integrate incoming data from multiple sources and direct output to multiple effectors, there's a level of metacognition that's required to be able for that to even be possible in any kind of organized, non-random way, in any kind of effective way that actually does active inference as opposed to looking the wrong way and driving into a wall. But there presumably needs to be some kind of automatic switch, as Mark and Karl were describing, to the longer term kind of metacognition that we associate with conscious metacognition, where there's a longer planning cycle. It's not so dependent on immediate inputs. It's much more dependent on memory. And it's not as much a matter of what do I do right now in this context as what I might do in a different context that I can project as a consequence in the long term of the context that I find myself in now.
So since you've, oh, sorry, Chris, carry on.
Oh, I mean, for any kind of planning agent, I think you need that kind of metacognition too. If it's going to be even planning what it's going to do later today.
So I think Chris has introduced the next most important issue in so the first issue is the one we discussed before. Chris just spoke about the inevitability and the automaticity of the threshold. But the second one is that insight, which is what you're asking us to talk about, it's a question of conscious insight as opposed to unconscious metacognition. And I think that that's probably what a large part of what you had in mind, Mike, when you asked us this question. So I want to add here that for me at least, the bedrock of consciousness is feeling. So we're speaking about an agent which is trying to survive. In other words, which is trying to optimize its ability to stay within its prior preference distribution. And this is where affect arises. So the feelings, the consciousness is the feeling of prioritized deviations from homeostatic settling points or preferred states. And the quality of that consciousness, which I say again is the basic elemental form of consciousness, I think it gives us a good opportunity to recognize just how far removed the conscious feeling is from the hidden causes. If we just reduce the hidden causes, and this is really a reduction, if we just reduce the hidden causes to introceptive states, in other words, what internal events within the organism are being registered by the sensory states of its blanket. in the form of a feeling, the difference between that feeling and the actual measurables going on within the organism, it's chalk and cheese. So this rough approximation, things are going badly in department called thirst, or in the department called hunger or thermoregulation or whatever. All you get is this feeling. And the feeling is conscious to assist you in the management of the uncertainty as to what you're doing about that feeling. This is where cognition comes in. The cognition is to explain the feeling. And by cognition, I include extraception. It's like what's causing me. It's both. So the hours where you start to explore your entire generative model to account for why am I feeling like this and what should I do about this. That's where the conscious part of it starts with the affect, in my view, and it gives us a good illustration of just how unveridical it is, if that's a proper English word. And then the cognition kicks in, and then there's a whole other question about how much of that metacognition that Chris has just been talking about, how much of that needs to be conscious. And then it loops back to the original questions. But I think that in my own view of that it has to do with optimizing your uncertainty, and that's where the consciousness pops in to the whole process we're talking about. So we're inevitably uncertain. We have to be, because we're blanketed agents. The Pareto frontier that we were talking about earlier means that it's not optimal to have maximal access to the hidden causes and to model them all in granular detail in any event. But then there's this whole second wave of which parts of your uncertainty that you're inevitably going to have do you then modulate? Because there's another question of a combinatorial explosion in terms of the precision modulation. So Thomas, we're now beginning to trench on psychiatric matters.
Yeah, I mean, I keep on thinking about sort of the clinical kind of ways in which we talk about introspection, and I assume as a sort of therapist and a psychoanalyst, Mark, the kind of introspection that often you are concerned with clinically is the ability to give reasons and to kind of explain one's own actions in a way that is coherent, which I guess feels on the surface like a different process to the ability of the system to sort of take its own temperature, as it were. And I'm not 100% sure when Mike asks which of these that perhaps he has more in mind. And I guess the issue of veridicality, particularly in analysis of the story that you give is it's extremely hard to adjudicate what is, how veridical someone's introspection is. And so when we talk about introspective ability in a person, at least, I'm not quite sure what we're talking about, actually, whether it's just a question of kind of very convincing storytelling or something about how effective that story is in guiding a person through their life. But I was thinking about, what would it be like if you could up the introspective ability, as Mike was sort of saying, and I think maybe Chris alluded to this in one of the earlier exchanges, but this kind of, this Hamlet phenomenon or sort of Woody Allen phenomenon. I think there is a sort of psychological evidence that shows you that the more sort of self-reflexive you are, if you don't balance that sort of self-attention with the ability to do something about it, you enter this kind of, neurotic sort of paralysis type state. And so this kind of idea of, well, what happens if we build novel agents and increase, their ability to kind of look under the hood without necessarily the ability to do much about it? It sort of raises the interesting idea of a kind of generation of neurotic AIs that are about to be kind of populate the world. But this idea in clinically of a kind of introspection that is a little bit more fine-grained. I mean, I'd give my right arm for that in my patients. Like so if you take pain, one of the biggest problems is you have a patient who comes in with pain and they are often saying, well, it's because I've got an inflammatory issue in my arm, or because my C fibers or small fibers or something, if they've read about that, or it's because of the injury I had. And of course, you know that they've had some sort of traumas or they've had various kind of injuries in the past. And so there is a question which presumably has an answer of what is, for this person's pain that they're experiencing there and then in front of you, what is the relative contribution of nociceptive input versus top-down sort of priors? And presumably, unlike, why did I tell my boss he was a jerk this morning? There's a bit more of a clearer answer to the pain question, and it would involve sort of taking the hood up and sort of looking into the sort of the generative model and the sort of inferential kind of process a little bit better. And I mean, that would seem like an extremely adaptive thing to be able to have in any system that you were designing, or in our patients or something like that, right?
The way I think about that is that so the feeling is conscious, as I said earlier, and then it's a question of why am I feeling this, and patients come up with all sorts of stories. Behind those conscious stories is the actual story, which is their generative model is creating this feeling, and it might have some beliefs which are not ideal, and which was why they're feeling the way that they are. So the clinical task, leaving aside psychopharmacology, I'm speaking now about psychological techniques as you are, Thomas. I think that the clinical task is to render uncertain, in other words, render more conscious, problematize the explanation that the patient comes up with. Now, that they resist. And that goes back, I don't know if you were part of our email string, Thomas. I quoted Freud, a wonderful letter. He said to Einstein that the mind is like the esophagus. It wants to flow in only one direction. And he meant extraceptively, and it doesn't want to look inwards. And if you do, you get a gag reflex. So we've got to help our patients to tolerate that gag reflex. In other words, to increase the amount of consciousness within their, the extent to which they're palpating the uncertainty in their generative model, but not to stay like that. I think that it's a reconsolidation process. So, there's all your answers questioned, and that's a state of uncertainty which you tolerate for the duration of the treatment. But the ideal then, again, going back to the very earliest point in our conversation, is to return to a modus operandi where it's the thing is running of itself, and that we don't want to be hyper conscious. That means we're hyper uncertain. We want to have a new improved generative model after that process, which then can run more automatically again. That's how I would think on it.
Mm-hmm. It makes you very worried about the fact that everyone is using AI as kind of personal therapists at the moment, because they're kind of almost attaching this kind of introspective, at least story making sort of appendage that's not going to allow that sort of dynamic shifting that you're referring to, and yeah, one can predict that perhaps it doesn't end well.
Yeah, I can only hope that these AI therapists can be improved upon. The ones that I've had any experience with, which I must confess has been secondhand, I've never consulted one of them myself, but I've heard patients telling me about what their bot therapist advised them over the weekend when I wasn't available, and that just seemed terribly sycophantic. They just go with every confabulation the patient comes up with and just say, "Right on, girl, you give it to them," and it doesn't bring about change.
But there'll be a time where you, or a version of you, will be available anytime the patient wants to see you. And can you imagine that? Presumably you're effective because you see someone a couple of times a week, or a few times a week, but the ability if someone is constantly introspecting by just being able to sort of access their phone, and I can see why that would be severely incapacitating.
What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about it from that angle, and in particular, this is what I was Okay, well, first of all, it started when it was some months ago. Thomas and I were talking. Thomas had asked about certain. Could we choose some primary axes where you have some sliders, and these axes would be the sort of fundamental basis of some of any kind of AI, and you can sort of any kind of any kind of agent, and you could sort of crank up the different dimensions, as it were. And so, what are those dimensions? And so, I was thinking in particular of not only as one primary dimension, not only as the degree of introspection, to what extent do you have any idea of why you're doing things or how to make yourself do things or that kind of thing. And the flip side of that, which is, the old saying, you can try to get what you want, but you can't want what you want, right? That the kind of thing. And so whether there's a kind of a scale-free nature there, whether some other being not like us could have multiple layers of not only can they decide what to actually try to do, but they have some control over what they want and maybe some control over that level, right? Like some number of levels up. And whether that's possible, it seems possible to me, but is it really possible? And if so, what would that look like? Where you can, where if you had that stronger metacognitive control, where you can look around and say, yeah, I have this, I love this sort of thing, but I'm looking around in my environment. It's really not very good that I like it. It's not going to work out well for me here. I'm going to turn that. And now I don't like it. I like something else. So some degree of control. It seems like we could engineer that. That doesn't seem impossible to engineer a system that has more control over that kind of stuff than we do. And so both on the sensing side and on control side, I was just wondering if we could, what the sort of the meta levels of that look like.
Yeah, it seems like we do have that multi-level, multi-time frame kind of ability in at least some aspects of life. One can choose to pursue a certain sort of career, which means going to graduate school, which means going to class, which means not staying out drinking all night, which means et cetera, down to shorter and shorter timescales, but all driven by some very long-term imagined objective, which may or may not ever come to pass. You have very high uncertainty about whether that will ever actually occur, given that you could be hit by a bus tomorrow, et cetera. And people do, from time to time, change those very long-term goals, which then cascades down into a whole reorienting of priorities on multiple, a series of shorter and shorter timescales that open up new aspects of behavior, make new aspects of behavior both desirable and even possible. So it seems like we do have that capability to some extent.
We have,
I don't know how much, for example,
yeah,
or how much variation there is.
We have some, but it's often, and I'm not even as much talking about long-term goals as I am about actual preferences. And maybe this gets to what Mark was talking about feelings, but like you can maybe through years of meditation or anger management or something, change some of this stuff, I guess. But it always seems to be an incredible hassle. And wouldn't it be, at least in some cases, like I always think about it, I look around and I see every fall there's all these people enjoying football. Okay, I could care less about football. But it looks like, wouldn't it be nice if I care too? Because then, like, if I liked football, there's all this fun stuff I could participate in. That would be amazing, right? So rather than years and years of visualization therapy where I try to talk myself into liking, like you could just go in and say, yeah, okay, that's a setting that's sort of not very optimal, like and say, fine, this I now like this, whereas I didn't before. And I'm not sure that we can do that, but it doesn't seem impossible that we could construct an agent that would collect meta information about. So I have these. I was born or made with these propensities. Some of these are not working out very well for me. Let me just, yes, I know I can layer all kinds of like forceful, self-control over that. But instead of that, let's just turn something more basic whereas before I liked, very spicy things. Now I like something else. It seems like it wouldn't be impossible to make an agent that had more control over those kinds of things, and it wouldn't take years of,
Yeah, I agree that the question you posed, or the way you reframed what we were saying a few questions ago, when you said, well, it's not only human beings, we're talking also about agents or hybrids, that we can engineer. And then surely it would be possible for us to set levels and increase veridicality and etc. I think that that's a very important point. I've recently had practical experience of that, because we in my lab are trying to engineer an artificially conscious agent, and it is just trying to meet its needs in a little environment that it lives in. And we found that the dynamics we were looking for were not sufficiently impressive, because its needs were not sufficiently incompatible with each other. So I think that the ideal that you're inviting us to consider, I think it would have a lot to do with what kind of prior preference distribution the agent has. Unfortunately, in our case, as far as I can tell, both in my own case and in the case of my patients, and my friends like Smoking Karl Friston, is that we have incompatible needs. We have needs which are radically in conflict with each other, and so there's trade-offs not only in terms of complexity and accuracy in relation to each one of them, but also what do you have to sacrifice in order to get the other thing. And then there's a further dimension, and I'm speaking now actually primarily about us humans, but I think it spans the two categories, and that is that circumstances change. So you develop a set of beliefs hierarchically arranged in terms of your certainty. So they are deeply automatized, low level, by which I mean deep predictions that you formed in infancy as to how best to deal with these competing needs in the environment you were in then. Then this is no longer so plastic. Now you find yourself in an entirely different environment where it's far from being the optimal the generative model. Then we get back to what we were saying earlier about with Thomas about, well, how do you go about changing it then? And that's inducing the esophagus to allow material to flow in the other direction. But I think it's a big problem for us that fundamentally we have needs which are irreconcilable at some level, in some contexts, at some stage in the lifespan, and the model is not sufficiently dynamic precisely because of its depth, because of the hierarchical nature of the generative model.
That raises
Which in my mind is, yeah, go ahead.
Raises an interesting question from the technological or engineering point of view, and that is, if we are acting as engineers, designing environments and designing systems to operate within those environments, or even if we're designing systems to operate, on Mars or under the ocean or something like that, some environment that we're not designing, but an open environment. To what extent can we design systems that don't have conflicting needs?
Mm-hmm.
So to what extent can we design systems that are psychologically unlike us in that particular respect? And if we're successful in that, then what seemed to be the deepest in this class of problems simply disappears. The one that you're referring to in particular, Mark, seems to disappear. So maybe that's an equally good framing of the question. Is it possible to have an agent that only has compatible needs? I don't know how to answer that question.
Yeah, and I think that this is probably we do it all the time. I think that we are the exception. The more complex the organism, the more likely it is to have multiple competing, conflicting needs. And the simple AIs that we are so familiar with, this is a large reason. It's not by any means the only reason, but it's a large reason why they're not conscious, is they don't have sufficient uncertainty about how to achieve their ends. But I saw Carl's hand going up. Carl is ever so polite.
Yes, and the smoker. Yeah, I'm trying to keep all these themes in mind because I think they can be tied together in a pragmatic way, which is why I put my hand up because there are so many ideas here that I was forgetting the first ones. But certainly when Mike was saying, can he find some therapist to make him like football? I immediately thought, well, people do that to stop smoking. So I think the smoking example is quite prescient here. And it also ties back to the therapy. I mean, we talk about engineering artificial intelligence or artificial artifacts to have this kind of introspection, metacognition. But I think exactly the same question could be asked in a therapeutic context. Not can we engineer somebody, but can we provide the right experiences, the right interactions, and possibly the right drugs that allows them to readjust and retune their preferences in the right kind of way. And I think that perspective speaks to a really simple knob or quantity that would accommodate all the perspectives that we just heard. And I think it's the prior preference over the outcomes or consequences of behavior. So if you now read the preferences as defining the kind of outcomes that characterize the kind of thing that I am, then internally consistent needs or preferences or things to which I work towards in terms of my intentional behavior, then can be quantified in terms of the constraints on those outcomes that drive me to very precisely preferred outcomes, or in other contexts, less precisely preferred outcomes. That precision, I think, is exactly the palpation of uncertainty, Mark, that you were talking about. And from a mathematical perspective, Thomas's lovely phrase, taking your own temperature, where you now read precision as inverse temperature when we're applying temperature as an attribute of our probability distributions, or those that are encoded, our Bayesian beliefs, as it were. That is just, I think, a lovely way of phrasing the kind of metacognition that we're all talking about here. But more specifically, I think it's the precision of your prior preferences, because if you can control that, and then you think about the maths of what drives behavior in terms of the expected information gain and the expected realization of your prior preferences, sometimes read as expected value or expected cost. If you reduce the precision of your prior preferences, so I no longer like smoking, for example, or I am not the kind of thing that smokes, then what will happen is you will be now emphasizing the epistemic part, the epistemic motivations to intentional behavior through increasing expected information gain. You become more exploratory. And I think that is the kind of mindset that you want to induce in a patient who's become very stuck in their ways. I am the kind of thing that is in pain. I am a patient in chronic pain. This is the simplest explanation for all the interoceptive, exteroceptive, and pro-social evidence at hand. I am a chronic pain patient. So if you can then reduce the precision of the beliefs about the outcomes that provide evidence that I am the simple explanation for the kind of thing that I am, then what you're talking about is either a pharmacological or psychotherapeutic endeavor to relax the precision of those particular prior preferences to help them getting out of that rut. So to my mind, that would be the, if you like, the therapeutic engineering, or allowing the patient to re-engineer their prior preferences so that they explore other ways of being, other interpretations, other notions that best explain the myriad of things that they experience. And of course, that should, in principle, change the evidence that they seek. And if they're now seeking a different kind of evidence, they now have an even better opportunity to engage in the epistemic foraging that comes from having relaxed precision over their prior beliefs. And then they can build new self-models, new generative models of the things that they prefer. Or we've used preferences, we've used needs. From a mathematical perspective, these are just prior beliefs about the outcomes that characterize the kind of thing that I am, the kind of self that I am. So I think that from that perspective, all of these notions hang together, even through to the what Chris introduced in terms of the system one versus system two, or the very notion of metacognition immediately tells you you've got a separation of temporal timescales, but more importantly, a deep generative model. And that's really important because if you want to now contextualize the precision over your needs, over your preferences, then it has to be contextualized on something that is actually represented in the generative model. And that, of course, is going to be another latent state, another latent cause that now can be possibly labeled as I am in this attentional or intentional state. And it can be labeled with affect, with emotions. And it's all about palpating uncertainty, feeling uncertainty in the sense of recognizing that there is a certain precision that is apt for this context. And some patients, you might imagine, now fail to recognize that there's an alternative way of preferring, or an alternative way of being. If I was an engineer, what we're talking about is basically the Kalman gain in a hierarchical Gaussian filter. So you could certainly, as a control engineer, you can use exactly the same to recognize that these particular prior preferences have been afforded too much gain, and it's not working. And then I'm going to have to change it, and you get into all sorts of various sort of instantiations, that empowerment. You could speak to Daniel Pollak about sort of recognizing I'm stuck in the corner, and I'm not going to be able to ever resolve any uncertainty. So I've got to change my preferences in terms of what I'm aiming for.
Yeah, that's especially interesting because we've been trying to push that kind of thing down into increasingly minimal systems, and in particular, I have a strong suspicion that some failures to regenerate, for example, right? So mammals not regenerating their limbs and things like this are partially that basically what you need to do is soften the priors of the cells who have become for good reason out in the wild and so on, but no longer, that now that we can keep things supported and clean and whatever, have really gotten stuck in this idea that we simply can't regenerate, right? And that some degree of softening this is part of a therapeutic strategy to get it going again. And there's one early bit of data that could be interpreted in this from this direction, which is that so our intervention is kind of two things. It's what we call a biodome, which is this wearable bioreactor that kind of sits on the limb amputation wound, and it provides kind of an aqueous environment and protection and all of that. And then there's some payloads, some ion channel drugs and things that we put in it. Well, in frogs, one of the things we found is that an empty biodome by itself already provides some degree, not as good as with a payload, but some degree of regenerative enhancement. And in a mammal, that would be obvious because, well, in the aqueous environment, currents can go better than dry air and all that. But the frog is already in a bucket of water. Why do you need a biodome on top of what's the point of having a biodome on top of a frog leg in a bucket of liquid anyway? And one hypothesis that you might make is that if you're a cell in a wound at the end of a frog limb sitting in a giant, basically an infinite bath, your evidence is that you have zero ability to influence your microenvironment. Anything you put in your microenvironment immediately diffuses away. You're powerless. You have no hope of doing anything, and you might as well scar over and be done with it. But in a biodome, you've got a very protected microenvironment. And if you do things and then take measurements of your environment, you find out that your efficacy over that environment is actually much higher, because now there's this protected little environment where you can, if I want more potassium out there, or I want more, whatever, you actually can do that. And so maybe we can give evidence to some of these things. to soften in general, and then to actually direct them in a way that sort of leads them to this notion that, yeah, maybe the prior model that prevented us from going down this regenerative pathway, maybe that wasn't necessarily how things have to be, and we could look at other ways to traverse that amorphous space. So this is, we're now thinking about various plastogens and the various other ways to get that idea across. Possibly also related to something else that we found is that the anthrobots that we make from human tracheal epithelia, if you look at the epigenetic age, they're younger than the cells they come from. They roll backwards, and one could also make this kind of crazy hypothesis that maybe the age that cells think they are is not set in stone by prior events, but is an estimate based on our history. So that if you then, so you have a history of being part of an elderly patient, whatever, but now you're in a very embryonic-like environment. You're being bent into a pretzel all of a sudden, and there's no other cells around, and there's a bunch of embryonic genes coming on. And maybe part of that is saying, no, there's some evidence that you're actually an embryo, and maybe you should revise your age estimate, something like that. And so that leads to another research program of asking, could we crank on that knob? Could we provide more evidence? And we have some ways of doing that. Provide some more evidence that you're an embryo. That's right. And see if we can roll the age estimate backwards.
That's absolutely fascinating. Sorry, go ahead, Karl.
Well, just very quickly, that's remarkable, and it fits exactly with the role of precision in defining how old you are, in the simple sense that if you're young, you're generally naive. If you're naive, there's lots of expected information out there to hoover up with the right sort of behavior.
Nice.
But that can only be realized if you have very precise beliefs. So if you have very precise, certain beliefs, there is no epistemic affordance to doing anything. So when you're young, you have to have this attenuated precision to be impressionable, to learn, and to respond very, very quickly to any sensory evidence. So literally the precision is the learning rate. And of course, when you get old and wise and grumpy and you're completely in control of your world, you don't need that anymore. You can't go bungee jumping or to discos and the like. So I think that's another beautiful example of the importance of precision, not just in terms of knowing what kinds of uncertainty to resolve, or indeed what to attend to, but how impressionable, how learnable. And you said something else very important though, which I just wanted to sort of foreground before I shut up. The way that the cell responds, or you have to empower the cell to elicit a response in virtue of putting it in a context where its actions matter. And I think that that kind of empowerment now underwrites all of this, because what I was talking about was the ability to engage in some epistemic foraging or respond to epistemic affordances. But of course, in order to do that, I have to be able to move. I have to be able to change the world by some kind of action.
Yeah, Mark, did you want to?
Yeah, I was just wondering. I mean, it is absolutely remarkable what where your mind works, going from one realm to another. It endlessly, I enjoy it endlessly, and it amazes me endlessly. But the work that you're doing is, it's just incredible in consequence of it. So I wanted to ask, what you said makes complete sense to me, and Karl's elaboration of it, the loosening up of the precision on the priors of those cells, and rendering their epistemic making them more open to epistemic foraging. That would be, I can see that, and I can see the enormous value and scope of it. But I wanted to ask you, is there a two-step process? The one thing is to make the cell more sort of labile, and then another thing to guide that lability. I mean, to what extent can you count on its new labile behavior being adaptive for the organism. Maybe it just goes on a whole kind of world tour on its own account, and then the next thing you have, neoplastic disease or something.
No, that's very important. And in fact, my suspicion is that's exactly what will happen around some of the. So currently, one of the most popular ways to try to achieve these kinds of outcomes is what they call cell reprogramming. So the idea is whether by Yamanaka factors or some other way, you take cells and you sort of roll them back to an undifferentiated state. And I have a feeling that's exactly the issue, right? Is that, you can crank the plasticity, but if you don't vector them in some way, you absolutely can get neoplasia and tumors and things like that. Our approach is going to be twofold. So there should be some kind of plastogen, but then there should be what, at least for us, typically is a bioelectric state of some sort that says you're an embryonic limb bud. Do the thing that embryonic limb buds do and make a leg, right? That's typically. I will say there is a very interesting phenomenon which we don't fully understand, which is the context sensitivity of this whole thing. In a tadpole, if so there are tadpole stages where they do not regenerate their tails, and it's an opportunity for us to sort of try to make them do that, right? So you cut the tail, or in an adult frog where you cut the leg. There is one reagent, which is called monensin, and it's a sodium ionophore, and we use it to induce depolarization. That monensin causes legs to regrow in a leg wound, and it causes tails to regrow in a tail wound. The treatment is exactly the same. There's very little specificity in the treatment as far as the two outcomes. We don't say what to grow. We literally just say, in effect, what you're saying is grow whatever normally goes here. And it figures out the rest. We have never seen the tail try to make a leg or the leg try to make a tail, or in fact, try to make anything else. We can, in other contexts, we can push it. We can make gut make an eye and things like that. But in this particular context, we didn't need to worry about it. The cells kind of knew what belongs there, and they just needed that push to actually do it. So it's going to be some combination of managing what do they already know, how strongly are they committed to it, and how hard do we need to work to get them to do something different? Because to some extent, they already know what belongs there. And this from very old. I think this is one of the most important old experiments where they would graft a salamander tail or an amphibian tail to the middle flank. And what it would do is over some period of time, it would actually remodel into a limb. And the tail tip cells would start to become fingers, even though there's no injury, there's nothing wrong at the tip of the tail, but there's a large scale plan. There's an error with respect to the large scale plan, and it would sort of propagate down into the molecular networks needed to turn tail tip cells into fingers. So to some extent, there appears to be information about what ought to be there. And if we can push it in that direction, it's still not clear to me how much micromanagement we're ever going to need to do on that.
Yeah. So this seems prima facie very different from the human psychology case, where the future actions for an individual seem very open-ended. There's no one particular thing that needs to be done, and just add a little motivation and it happens.
Well,
I think in human psychology we do have reflexes and instincts of phenotypic predictions as to how to remain within your viable bounds. It's just that they're not memories. You can't reconsolidate them. They are fixed action patterns that are hardwired. We can supplement them with alternatives that are more context sensitive and nuanced and flexible and so on. But we do have that sort of bedrock of phenotypic predictions. This is a pain situation, withdraw. This is a danger situation, flee. This is a frustrating obstacle, attack. So unless I'm misunderstanding you, I think that would be the the psychological equivalent of what Mike's talking about. But I hesitate to say psychological equivalent because what Mike's talking about is psychology too, as he's taught us to recognize. But at the level of more complex organisms, the ones that we're more familiar with, that I'm more familiar with, like us, even we do have very high precision priors about how to stay within our viable bounds that are inviolable. They can only be supplemented. They can't be extinguished.
And this is like super whatever at the edge of things, but could we go in the opposite direction rather than for the human case that Chris was just asking about, rather than looking down at the instincts and things like this, go large scale and say that are there people with some sort of a large scale life mission where you can try to suppress it, you can, maybe they need a little bit of an oomph to kind of get going, but boy, there really is a large scale trajectory, not so much a plan because it's going to have different ways of implementing, but some sort of a I guess there's probably pathological versions of this, but I'm more thinking of the sort of positive case where someone has a life mission of some sort, and once you sort of release the brakes on it, they're just going to go do the thing the same way that the cells are going to say, now we really should be a limb, let's do whatever we have to do to turn this thing into a limb. Do you see that in patients and in people in general?
Well, at the one level, you're saying you're going from the one extreme to the other. So let's stick with the first extreme. What Panksepp calls the seeking drive, which is a homeostatic need, the epistemic foraging that Karl was talking about earlier. There's a phenotypic prediction, which, if I can translate it into words, is seek and ye shall find. And so we explore, we are curious, we're engaged with the world, we're interested, and so on. At the other level, which is where the five of us live, look at us, we've all prioritized that drive, and we are all living lives like that, where all of us are on a mission, and it's great. But it's because of this balance that I was speaking about earlier, or these conflicts, it comes at the cost of other drives, unfortunately for all of us, and it can go too far. And there lies mania and megalomania, and so on. And bring us back to the present.
There's depression as well. I was just thinking about the analogy of the frog limb being dissected and removed. I mean, that's a traumatic intervention. You're massively changing the context, and you're creating a delusion in these cells that they have no capacity to grow or influence their environment. And that would be a little bit like somebody who had severe agoraphobia, who has now, say, lost somebody and has developed a sort of a social phobia and will not go out of the house and is completely socially withdrawn. You're adopting a prior which is atypical, and if you like, the biodome intervention is to now empower them to go out there and seek evidence, and in fact they can still be part of a social ecostructure or niche, allowing them to relax their prior belief. No, I am a depressed person who cannot interact with other people. So in response to sort of Chris's observation and Mike's question, the natural way to grow back the arm for people is exactly what Mark just said. It's to express mental well-being through being curious under constraints, and those constraints are usually compassion to others, but it's effectively just all the hallmarks, all the social norms that render us, yes, this is me, well, in a state of well-being. Because any deviation from that, then a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist is going to call you a patient and will try and get you back growing again.
And I think that's why introspection can be so damaging sometimes, because if you have introspection without the ability to sort of fix whatever problems you find, that feels like a recipe for depression in any kind of system.
Interesting.
But I was struck by the point you were making, Carl, about the changing the precision of prior preferences as a sort of important methodology towards sort of well-being, because in some traditions, and I know you've done some stuff sort of looking at meditation traditions, essentially what you're trying to do before the well-being sort of kicks in is you're actually cultivating a kind of holy disinterest, right? And in fact, presumably what that is it's a notching down of the precision of your prior preferences, in the extreme case, to the state where you're almost the uncertainty is no longer there, the prediction area is no longer there, and you get these incredible cessation experiences where sort of experience stops altogether. But on the other side of that, you then get this sort of post-reboot state where everything suddenly appears a lot more plastic. Suddenly your kind of your eros in life becomes much more apparent. Your diamond or whatever it is, pops up beside you and starts showing you the way. And that kind of language is so analogous. That reboot terminology is so analogous with what we're seeing in psychedelics. That you reboot the system, and if you have the appropriate scaffolding, kind of pre and post, you can help steer it, the system on the right way. And actually, and we were writing something with Mike about this kind of peculiar persistence of this reboot analogy in medicine throughout history. And it's there in ECT, it's there in cardioversion, it's there in fecal microbiota transplantation, it's there in sort of various immunotherapies, and this kind of notion of sort of a big injection of, I don't know what, entropy or something, that then sort of presumably reduces the precision of whatever these preferences are. And then after the reboot, there's the opportunity to kind of reset those set points, whether they're kind of homeostatic set points or whatever, and sort of re-incline the system towards something a little bit more adaptive, eudaimonic, or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an important nuance to that summary, which speaks to Mike was using the word plasticigen earlier on, and you're implying that ECT and psychedelics have this sort of neuroplastic potential to reshape your landscape, pointing in a different, so that your valleys or your the ruts that you were once in are now pointing in a different direction, or indeed the precision is now relaxed to the extent that those ruts now open up. And I'm sort of using those words because this is something Robin Carhart-Harris has been trying to emphasize about the psychedelic angle, that there is an immediate short-term effect on synaptic efficacy, which would be a little bit, if you're an engineer, like sort of introducing simulated annealing. You're now increasing the temperature or reducing the precision, the inverse temperature, to jump out of your minima, jump out of your rut. But there's also, over the ensuing weeks and months, increased neuroplasticity aspect to it, so that not only have you now flattened your landscape to explore other ways of being and other options, but there's also a certain plasticity in the self-carving of the canals, that such you can canalize your new landscape. So I think that sort of short and long-term aspects of therapeutic intervention are important. It's not just about inference in the moment, but also the capacity to learn subsequent to that reset moment.
Yes, and I think that's why the sort of a lot of the psychedelic literature, for example, has kind of possibly not. There's this kind of unwritten assumption that whatever the reboot is happening is a positive thing that's going to incline towards the positive. And there are so many examples now, whether it's the horrible music festival in Israel or something, where people have been in these very plastic states and something awful has happened, and it's the outcome has been a long way from inclining them towards something positive. So I agree. It's that sort of the longer term scaffolding is hugely important.
So it's amazingly it's identical to the question that I posed to Mike about, is it a two-stage process? You increase plasticity, and then how much do you have to guide it? So it's for precisely the reasons we're talking about now that I'm always very alarmed when colleagues working with psychedelics speak of doing away with the psychotherapeutic aspect of it. It's psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, and I really can't overemphasize the importance of the psychotherapeutic use of that window of opportunity, because it's by no means necessarily going to reset in a benign or adaptive direction. And I like the analogy with ECT and even with deep brain stimulation. Helen Mayberg, when she had those initial very promising findings, even then she was saying, the DBS is step one. Then you need to take the patients into psychotherapy. They wouldn't have been able to use psychotherapy if they didn't have the DBS, but the DBS is not a cure.